I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive stamped on those lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed them. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch away." Kind of makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside. That poem, Ozymandias, by Percy Bysshe Shelley, talks about the futility of empires. And of course, what are we talking about? Well, the fact that the United States, during the late 19th and early 20th century, you guessed it, builds itself an empire. Now, I read this poem for 3 or 4 reasons. Maybe optional reason one is to demonstrate to my English colleagues that you guys do get a smattering of culture and poetry and literature in this course. Reason two is to prove that I am no Bryan Cranston. Reason three is the fact that Ozymandias is a really rock and roll name. If Mr. Dry has any more kids, I think Ozymandias Dry is probably a pretty good name. You think of a middle one. What about Ozymandias Diocletian Dry? Anyway, those 3 reasons aside, maybe the actually historically relevant reason is the fact that it demonstrates that scholars, poets, intellectuals have long talked about the sheer futility of empires. The fact that empires fall. It's not called The Rise of the Roman Empire. Gibbon didn't write that book. It's called The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. Luke Skywalker doesn't save the Death Star. He blows up the Death Star. It's not the preservation of Rome in 476. It's the sack of Rome in 476. Empires are inherently a somewhat futile gesture. And yet, they happen. And the question is, why does the United States embark upon the quest for empire? Especially when you consider that the United States is a very unlikely imperial power. Remember, in our identity, at the core of identity, we are a country that gains our independence from an empire, and yet we then turn around and build one. Maybe to paraphrase the Dark Knight trilogy, maybe you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. So there might be some kind of karmic effect, the fact that we gain independence from probably the largest of all colonial empires at that point, but then we become one ourselves. Wait, Mr. Dry. How long was I out? Is Manifest Destiny still like a thing? Well, what a very astute and timely question, 3 a.m. You might remember during the late 19th century that historians like Frederick Jackson Turner were talking about the end of the frontier and what a big deal that is in American history because there's always been a frontier. So the end of the frontier occurs in the 1890s approximately. And it's around that time period that the United States becomes very interested in creating an overseas empire. So, and then we briefly talked about that in the lecture on the Western frontier, but maybe that's not entirely coincidental. The fact that as Manifest Destiny in the West ends, you see the expansion of empire in the Pacific. So you can argue that maybe the United States has always been an imperial power to a certain extent, because ultimately it's always been defined by expansionism, and maybe Manifest Destiny, or rather overseas imperialism, is just Manifest Destiny using steamships rather than Conestoga wagons. But whatever your position on that is, we do have to talk about what we mean by empires, because the term empire is vague and not particularly helpful. So we also sort of have to talk about the way empires used to be during the 18th century. Because remember, this actually is kind of further elaboration on our backstory because we were a part of an overseas empire. But if you're looking at the old British Empire of the 18th century, the one that we were a part of, remember that the British sort of saw their colonies as useful for extracting resources and also to kind of serve as markets. But in the case of the American colonies, it was more the second one, for the most part. And so what also is kind of the case is that if you look at where the old European empires tended to settle. It was very often in coastal areas, and it was very often in areas that could serve as marketplaces, right? You could use those areas to sell goods. That's why, for example, in the early 19th century, the British were so focused upon China. They wanted to occupy spheres of influence in China so they could basically take advantage of the fact that they could sell, to a Chinese market things that they desired, which was eventually opium for the most part, but that's a whole different story. You don't really see empires in, let's say, the Arabian Peninsula, or you don't really see empires sort of in areas that are geographically inhospitable. And there's a good reason for that. They're geographically inhospitable. But something changes by the middle of the 19th century. Suddenly, the goal isn't just to occupy or colonize decent marketplaces. Instead, the goal is just to gobble up as much land and territory as possible. Even little Belgium gets sort of involved in the great race for empire by colonizing what is today the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then tragically killing off a lot of the population. And the reason for that is that the Industrial Revolution changes everything. Because remember that the Industrial Revolution involves this exponential increase in production and the increase of manufacturing stuff. And to manufacture a lot of stuff, you need a lot of raw materials. Well, where are you going to get those raw materials? Well, it's really great if you can basically find all of that stuff domestically. But an industrial economy actually requires more resources than generally any one country can provide. You usually need great sources of energy, coal, for example, but also as we begin to see more sophisticated pieces of technology, you need things like rubber, for instance. By the way, the automobile is, coming down the pike, probably literally and figuratively, and so you need rubber tires because tires made of other stuff just don't really work out that well. The problem is that rubber is actually manufactured through a process called vulcanization, and you need refineries for that, but you also need just rubber. Rubber is actually something that is extracted from a tree, and it's basically it's sort of native to tropical environments. Well, if you are a non-tropical country, for instance, well, sucks to be you, unless you have access to those forests, which is one of the reasons why, by the way, you see an expansion of European, American, and Japanese empires into areas that historically other empires in the past had avoided. So the the second industrial revolution has increased competition for resources. So, and usually resources that were necessary to sustain an industrial economy. So that's point one, and we'll sort of talk about that in the United States specifically, because as we're going to find, you also have sort of a fixation on certain cash crops, like sugar in the case of Hawaii and Cuba for the United States. But yeah, it's this focus and demand for resources. But there's another sort of explanation here because, in some respects, it would just be easier if those businesses that need those resources just go out and buy them. And sometimes that did happen. I mean, the United States, by the way, never colonized Brazil. Brazil was an independent country in its own right, but at the same time, Henry Ford does buy hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of Brazilian rainforest to basically use for a rubber tree plantation. You didn't need to create an overseas empire for that, right? You can just kind of let the free market, laissez-faire capitalism, sort of do that. So empires sound really expensive, and if you remember the experience that Great Britain goes through in its heyday, if you're not careful about that, the expense of empire can actually be the undoing of empire. So, what leads the United States and other countries around this time period to take an extra step? Well, some of it is about nationalism. And the fact that this is also coinciding with the fact that there are other emerging great powers in the world at this time. Specifically, go back here, specifically Germany, Japan, and arguably the United States. And so, if you take a superficial look at history, one conclusion that you might draw from history might be that large and powerful countries develop overseas empires. It's just something you do. It's a fad. And so, if you want to demonstrate that your country has made it, if your country wants its place in the sun, then maybe it would be a good idea to show how awesome you are by also creating an overseas empire of your own. Probably the most ridiculous example of this is Germany in the late 19th and early 20th century. This is a little TMI, but Germany had basically embarked upon a course of not building an overseas empire because Otto von Bismarck said, and I'm paraphrasing, "That's bloody stupid." Well, of course, Bismarck's sort of successor, kind of, even though he wasn't chancellor, is Kaiser Wilhelm II, who decides that Germany also wants its place in the sun by basically settling parts of southern Africa, most notably this area, and also carving out bits and pieces of what is present-day New Guinea. Why does Germany do this? Well, resources, maybe, but really, if we're being completely honest with ourselves, it's because Kaiser Wilhelm II was the grandson of Queen Victoria. And whenever he went to family reunions and gatherings in London, he was always picked on by his British relatives. And so Kaiser Wilhelm II, never one to take an insult lightly, decides that he's going to stand up to the British by building a better empire than theirs. Does he do that? No. But he does try. But there's another, like, let's say, less Freudian, less insane or idiosyncratic reason for empire, and that is the strategic reason. And this is actually something that's more relevant to the United States. Pause. This is our first introduction to Kaiser Wilhelm II. Kaiser Wilhelm II, from this point, will be sort of a spiritual presence in this course. He's going to be in the background for a while, and he might lure you into a false sense of security, thinking that he's gone away. But when you least expect it, he's going to come up and surprise you. So just be aware that we're going to see some Kaiser Wilhelm II moments in this course from this point forward. Be excited. The other important reason, going back, is this man. Alfred Thayer Mann. Alfred Thayer Mann was a naval officer and professor who wrote the book The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, 1660 to 1783. I know, a page turner. While you are checking the book to download for your Kindles, I think we should probably go ahead and sort of go back to a point that I made about the importance of books in history. Some books are important because just a lot of people read the thing. Some books are important because of their novel or revolutionary ideas. Some books are important, though, because people in positions of power read them. If you were to, basically walk around the streets of New York City in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and say, hey, reading up on the influence of sea power upon history, I'm not sure that anybody would respond with, you know it, because not many people read the book, except people in positions of authority. So, for example, Kaiser Wilhelm II, not really an avid reader himself, apparently committed vast tracts of it to memory. Theodore Roosevelt, who is going to be significant very soon, was also an avid reader of the book. So the influence of sea power was influential to people with a lot of power, decision making powers. So, what does the book say? Well, man is trying to answer a very simple yet pretty complicated question. Why Britain? If you think about Britain, or rather England, if we're talking about before 1707, um, England slash Great Britain is kind of sad and underwhelming. It's basically, the British Isles are basically a series of islands in the North Sea that are soggy, and I guess they are blessed with an abundance of sheep for wool if you're looking at the Middle Ages. But, England was sort of a medieval backwater for most of its history. That's why the Norman invasion happened with the Pope's blessing, because the Pope didn't care. It wasn't France, it wasn't the Holy Roman Empire, it's England. Who wants to go to England? It's moldy and grimy, and the food's terrible. So, yeah, and yet, if you look at where the British Empire is by the year 1920, the British Empire comprises something like 25% of the surface of the earth. And the British Empire isn't an empire like the Roman Empire. It's not an empire that really tries to consciously go out and conquer new territories under some idea of Pax Romana or manifest destiny. I mean, sure, the British don't mind five-finger discounting India or South Africa, but the fact is that a lot of the British Empire's expansion is the result of improvisation rather than being part of some master plan or grand strategy. And yet, the British Empire is arguably more successful than many of these other empires that, like Napoleon's empire, for example, or Genghis Khan's empire. These empires that go out with the explicit purpose of kind of conquering for its own sake. That's not, whatever the flaws of the British Empire, that's not really something that the British try to do. So, how do we explain going from this to this? That's one heck of a before and after shot, right? Mahan says that it's all about trade. Whoop-de-doo. So I know that that's not exactly like an earth-shattering revelation, but Mann argues that it's really trade that makes the British Empire what it is. But it's not just trade, because other empires have, liked trade. Trade is not a new or innovative concept. It's only been around since, at the very least, since the Lydians developed currency. Maybe 4,000 or so years ago, give or take, and probably earlier than that. So, what is it about trade specifically that makes the British so powerful? Well, Mann argues that it's not just trade, it's also the fact that the British have a powerful navy to protect that trade, and protect it all over the world. Well, Mann also argues that if you want that powerful navy, you also need naval bases to project power all over the world, because people knew that if you messed with the British Navy, whether it was in Britain's backyard in the English Channel, or, for example, in the East China Sea, bad stuff was going to go down. You were going to get shelled into oblivion because the British could probably park a warship off your coast within about a week and, again, rain down unholy tea-soaked fire. So, that's kind of how it works. The British have naval power they can use to defend their trade, and they can project it all over the world, but that only works because the British have naval bases in places like Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, South Africa, the Falkland Islands, Singapore, Hong Kong, and so that means that they can more easily project that military power if they want to. So What that also means, though, is that if you want overseas naval bases, you also kind of need overseas territory, unless you can find a way to lease that territory from another country, which sometimes happens, but not reliably. So you see the emergence of overseas colonization to a certain extent, just to sort of establish these naval bases. Now, what's interesting is that man endorses um, American control of the Caribbean Sea. And of course, that's significant because we also know that the United States becomes very interested in Cuba, but also other islands in the Caribbean around this time period. He also believes that the United States should build some kind of canal that connects the Pacific Ocean with the Caribbean Sea. Because the problem for the United States is that if you want a powerful navy, you really have to build two navies, one for the eastern coast, one for the western coast. And that puts the United States in a position of vulnerability because if the west coast gets attacked and all your ships are here, well, then they have to go around basically Tierra del Fuego up through the Pacific. And remember that that was pretty tough for Magellan back in the day, and it really hasn't gotten easier with time. So if you build a canal somewhere here, it basically allows you to do more with less. It allows you to basically concentrate your naval power um, closer to the United States and be able to respond more easily to any attacks or any developments. So, by the way, this is, of course, important, spoiler, because the United States eventually does build a canal in Panama, and it does extend territorial control and influence over a large portion of the Caribbean. The final reason, and admittedly probably the most tragic one, is the idea that the people who are being colonized are in some way, shape, or form inferior. What's interesting is that that assumption of inferiority sort of created two different approaches that ultimately sort of led to the same thing anyway. So this is a time period in which, even though we're after the Civil War and the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendments have been passed, it's still the time period of Jim Crow. It's the time of the Carlisle Indian School. It's the time of the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's a time period in which legalized racism is still very much the norm. So the idea, I mean, in a time in which American citizens are sometimes thought of as being inferior on the basis of race, it shouldn't surprise us that people from other countries are sometimes classified by Americans at that time period as being inferior on the basis of race or culture. And there's two kind of, you know, thoughts here. And that is that, this is the time period of social Darwinism. The idea of scientific racism, the idea that, it's a time period where there's an assumption that empires are kind of a sign of fitness. The British have an empire, the French have an empire, the Germans are developing an empire. The United States should develop an empire as a sign of fitness. Well, the fact that, for example, China does not have an empire. Well, it kind of does actually, but the fact that many of the countries that are being colonized do not have empires are kind of seen as a demonstration of inferiority. So the other thing with social Darwinism is, of course, the idea of might makes right. Social Darwinism is not a moral philosophy. It basically says that you should do something because you can. It's a means to survive. On the other hand, though, there is another approach that's still based in some idea of inferiority, but it's not, it does have some moral reasoning. It's just the moral reasoning is terrible. And that is the idea of paternalism. There is, in some ways, what's really interesting is that it's almost going back to the three G's. God, glory, and gold. Remember that the Spanish colonized, well, then the Portuguese colonized the New World for gold and glory, but there was a substantial effort to convert the population of the Western Hemisphere to Christianity. And we kind of see vestiges of this. There's this kind of assumption uh, that many people, especially in areas that had not been colonized by European powers, had not been converted to Christianity, and it was the duty of Christians to basically do their bit to spread the gospel. Uh, and we kind of see there's a combination of racial and religious logic here. There's a Protestant minister by the name of Josiah Strong who says the Anglo-Saxon was divinely commissioned to be in particular, or sorry, in a peculiar sense, his brother's keeper. The idea is that British and American colonists should basically go overseas and secure control of different countries and administer them more efficiently. Now, of course, it gets into bizarre situations where, for example, when the United States colonizes the Philippines, basically taking control away from the Spanish, apparently Americans failed to sort of realize that the majority of the population of the Philippines is Roman Catholic. The same for Cuba. And, you know, there is a sort of like depressing and yet almost kind of tragically funny naivete here. But there is this sense that imperialism is a sign of compassion. It's a way of sort of lifting up oppressed peoples of the world. Um, what's also really twisted about this is that some of the advocates for empire were also people we kind of broadly associate with the social gospel movement. It's the same kind of logic. And we also talked about the fact that the social gospel movement and the progressives in general, they kind of have a blind spot when it comes to issues of race and culture. So that sort of sets the stage for this second wave of imperialism. Next time, we'll talk about early attempts at American overseas expansion and colonization.